Christmas Eve. Chicago surrendered to a blizzard that seemed intent on swallowing the city whole. Snow fell in thick curtains, muffling the sounds of traffic and turning streetlights into dim halos struggling against the white darkness. The wind howled through the urban canyons, piling drifts against storefronts and rendering the usually bustling downtown into something resembling a frozen ghost town. Weather bulletins had been warning about this storm for 3 days, but nothing could have prepared the city for the ferocity that descended upon it. Roads were closing by the hour. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and somewhere in the chaos, lives hung in the balance. From the warm interior of his limousine, Henry Ashford watched the chaos unfold with the detached interest of a man observing a documentary about a world he no longer belonged to. At 42, he had accumulated enough wealth to insulate himself from virtually any inconvenience, yet no amount of money could purchase the one thing he truly needed. His reflection stared back at him from the tinted window, a face that graced business magazines and charity galas, but remained utterly unknown to anyone who might have called him friend. The leather seat beneath him cost more than most people made in a month. The champagne chilling in the console had been shipped from France specifically for his personal consumption. And yet, surrounded by all this luxury, Henry felt nothing but the familiar emptiness that had become his constant companion. Bernie, his driver of 11 years, navigated the treacherous streets with practiced ease. He was the only person who dared speak to Henry without an appointment, without an agenda. And tonight he had already tried twice to wish his employer a Merry Christmas. Both attempts had been met with silence. Bernie had learned long ago not to take it personally. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Henry Ashford's coldness was not cruelty. It was armor built over 15 years of grief, 15 years of refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. The limousine slowed at a red light near the underpass on West Madison Street. Here, the glittering facade of downtown Chicago gave way to something raw, something the tourism brochures never mentioned. Garbage cans overturned by the wind, cardboard shelters disintegrating in the wet snow, the forgotten corners where the city's invisible residents fought their daily battles for survival. Steam rose from grates in the sidewalk, providing what little warmth could be found in this frozen landscape of abandonment. Henry's gaze drifted toward the concrete pillars of the overpass, and that was when he saw them. A woman crouched against the frozen ground, her thin jacket torn at the shoulder, her body curved protectively around a small child. The snow had already begun to accumulate on her back, as if the storm itself was trying to bury them both. Even from this distance, Henry could see the violent shivers that racked the woman's frame, could see the desperate way she hunched over her child as if she could shield her from the cold with nothing but willpower and love. But it was the child who captured Henry's attention and held it with the force of a physical blow. A little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with tangled dark hair and lips that had gone an alarming shade of purple. She lifted her head, and her eyes found the limousine through the swirling snow. There was something in those eyes, something fierce and desperate and heartbreakingly hopeful. With trembling fingers, she reached toward the fogged glass of a nearby store window and traced a single, unmistakable shape, a star. Then her hands moved again, forming a sign that Henry recognized instantly, a sign that reached across the years and grabbed him by the throat. Help. The word wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. Henry had learned sign language 15 years ago, taught by hands that would never move again, hands that had belonged to someone who had meant everything to him. His younger sister, Clara, born deaf, brilliant beyond measure, taken by a car accident at 19. He had thought that chapter of his life was closed, sealed away behind walls of work and wealth and carefully cultivated distance. He had built an empire, partly because building things kept him from thinking about all he had lost. But a dying child's silent plea had the power to break through any wall. Henry was out of the car before Bernie could even put it in park. The wind slammed into him immediately, driving ice crystals into his face and stealing the breath from his lungs. His Italian leather shoes, worth more than most people's monthly rent, sank into the filthy snow. He didn't notice. His entire being had narrowed to a single purpose, a single thought that drowned out 15 years of carefully constructed emotional distance. The woman looked up as he approached, and instead of hope, he saw fear flash across her exhausted features. She pulled the child closer, her arms forming a cage of protection around the small body. Her eyes held the wary alertness of a hunted animal. Someone who had learned the hard way that extended hands often came attached to conditions, demands, dangers she had trusted before. Her expression seemed to say, she had been burned before. Why should this stranger be any different? Henry knelt in the snow, ruining his $3,000 coat without a second thought. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke, he also signed the words, his fingers forming shapes that felt rusty from disuse but came back to him like breathing, like Clara had never left at all. The little girl watched his hands with wide, fever-bright eyes. Recognition flickered across her face. Someone else in the world spoke her secret language, the language her mother had taught her for emergencies exactly like this one, when Henry signed the word safe. Something in her expression shifted, not quite trust, but perhaps the first fragile stirring of hope. Behind them, barely visible through the curtain of snow, a figure stood motionless beneath a distant streetlight. Neither Henry nor the woman noticed. They were too focused on each other, on the child, on the desperate negotiation happening in the space between fear and faith. But in the fresh powder, a third set of footprints had appeared, running parallel to theirs before stopping abruptly, watching, waiting. Henry lifted the child into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her small body far too light for her age. And the heat radiating from her skin spoke of a fever that had already climbed to dangerous heights. Her breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps that made his chest tighten with urgency. This wasn't just a cold. This wasn't just exhaustion. This child was fighting for her life, and she was losing. The woman rose on unsteady legs, her hand gripping Henry's sleeve with desperate strength. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked 1,000 questions. Who are you? Why are you helping? What do you want? What price will I have to pay for accepting this kindness? Henry had no answers that would satisfy her suspicion. He only knew that for the first time in 15 years, he felt something other than the cold emptiness that had become his constant companion. He felt necessary. He felt human. Bernie had already opened the rear door, his face a mask of professional concern that couldn't quite hide his surprise. In 11 years, he had never seen Henry Ashford touch another human being voluntarily. Now his employer was climbing into the back seat with a sick child cradled against his chest and a terrified woman following close behind. As the limousine pulled away from the underpass, the figure beneath the streetlight stepped forward into a pool of orange light. The glow illuminated hard features, a cruel mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. He watched the taillights disappear into the blizzard, then reached for his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "They're on the move," he said. "Heading north. The Ashford Grand. Most likely." His voice carried no emotion, just the flat efficiency of someone reporting routine business. And the evidence is still with her. The Ashford Grand Hotel rose 17 stories above Michigan Avenue, its Art Deco facade softened by thousands of Christmas lights that transformed it into a beacon of warmth against the storm. Inside, the lobby gleamed with marble floors and crystal chandeliers, a towering Christmas tree dominating the center of the space like a monument to seasonal excess. Guests in designer clothes sipped champagne and laughed at jokes that weren't funny, secure in the knowledge that the ugliness of the world could never touch them here. String quartets played carols. Waiters glided between groups with silver trays. Everything was perfect, polished, deliberately designed to exclude any reminder of the suffering just beyond the doors, into this sanctuary of privilege. Henry Ashford carried a fever-stricken child wrapped in his ruined coat. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. A woman in a fur coat actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had witnessed something obscene. The hotel manager, a woman named Rosalind Chen, who had spent 20 years mastering the art of maintaining appearances, felt her professional smile falter for the first time in recent memory. But it was Ingrid Lowe who stepped forward to intercept them, her security badge glinting under the chandelier light. At 38, Ingrid ran the hotel's security operation with military precision, and she hadn't survived 15 years in this industry by allowing surprises to derail her protocols. Her past was a mystery she kept tightly guarded, but those who had seen her handle crises suspected she had training that went far beyond hotel management courses. "These people cannot go upstairs without documentation and verification," she said. Her voice pitched low to avoid creating a scene among the guests. Her eyes swept over the woman's torn clothing, the child's labored breathing, cataloging threats both real and potential. This could be a scam. It could be extortion. It could be an elaborate setup designed to compromise one of the city's wealthiest men. Henry didn't slow his stride toward the private elevator. "The child is dying. I'm taking her to my suite. You can verify whatever you want afterward." Ingrid fell into step beside him, her objections dying on her lips as she caught sight of the little girl's face. Blue-tinged lips, skin that had gone from flushed to waxy pale, the rapid, shallow breathing of lungs struggling against infection, whatever her suspicions about the mother. No security protocol was worth a child's life. "I'm calling Dr. Finn," she said instead, reaching for her radio. "And I'm posting someone at your door, for everyone's protection." The penthouse suite occupied the entire 17th floor, a sprawling expanse of luxury that Henry had never bothered to personalize. 12,000 square feet of marble and silk and priceless art, and not a single photograph of family or friends anywhere to be seen. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like exactly what it was: an expensive coffin for a man who had stopped living years ago. Dr. Marcus Finn arrived within 10 minutes, his medical bag already open before he cleared the threshold. He was a quiet man in his 50s, the hotel's on-call physician, accustomed to treating the minor ailments of wealthy guests. Headaches from too much champagne, upset stomachs from too much foie gras. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found in Henry Ashford's suite. The child lay on the master bed, her small body almost lost among the Egyptian cotton sheets. Her mother hovered nearby, refusing to let anyone get between her and her daughter, her hands constantly checking the child's forehead, her breathing, the flutter of her pulse. Every few seconds, she would glance toward the door, toward the windows, as if expecting danger to burst through at any moment. "Pneumonia," Dr. Finn announced after his examination. "Severe. The infection has spread deep into both lungs. She needs a hospital, needs IV antibiotics and oxygen support and constant monitoring. But with this storm, I don't know if an ambulance can make it through." He looked at Henry with eyes that held both professional concern and personal confusion. "We'll have to manage here for now. The next few hours will be critical if her oxygen levels drop any lower. We'll have no choice but to risk the roads." Henry watched as the doctor set up an IV line, administered medications, attached monitoring equipment that beeped and hummed in the silence. Throughout it all, the little girl's eyes remained fixed on him, tracking his movements with an intensity that made him feel simultaneously uncomfortable and anchored. It was as if she had decided he was her lifeline, and she refused to let him out of her sight. When the initial crisis had stabilized and the child's breathing had eased slightly, Henry knelt beside the bed and signed a simple question. "What is your name?" The child's fingers moved weakly, the gestures imprecise but understandable. "Audrey." Henry felt something crack in his chest, a fault line in the ice he had built around his heart. Clara had always said that one day. Something would break through, that you couldn't lock yourself away from the world forever. He had spent 15 years proving her wrong. But here, now, watching this small child fight for her life, he felt the first cracks forming in walls he had thought were impenetrable. He signed back. "I'm Henry. You're safe here." Audrey's hand reached out and gripped his fingers with surprising strength. Her other hand traced the shape of a star on the blanket, over and over, a ritual that seemed to comfort her even as her eyes grew heavy with medication-induced sleep. The star, the universal symbol of hope. The first thing she had drawn when she had seen his limousine through the snow. Across the room, Audrey's mother watched this exchange with an expression that shifted from suspicion to bewilderment to something that might have been the first tentative stirring of trust. She hadn't spoken more than a few words since they'd arrived, but now she moved closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know sign language?" Henry didn't look up from Audrey's sleeping face. "Someone I loved very much taught me. A long time ago. My sister. She was deaf from birth. Brilliant, beautiful, and gone too soon. I learned because I wanted to share her world, and now that world keeps pulling me back in ways I never expected." The woman was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. Then she said, "My name is Serafina, my daughter. She learned to sign because I taught her, in case she ever needed to call for help without making a sound, in case screaming would put her in more danger than staying silent." The weight of that statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Henry didn't yet fully understand. But before he could ask, his phone buzzed with a message from Rosalind. "Someone is asking questions about your guests. A man claiming to be from Child Protective Services. His credentials check out. But something about him feels wrong. His questions are too specific. He knows too much." Henry looked at Serafina and saw the color drain from her face. She had seen the message over his shoulder, and the fear that flooded her features was absolute and devastating. "He found us," she whispered. "Oh God, he found us." The next 3 hours unfolded like a nightmare choreographed by someone with intimate knowledge of Serafina's deepest fears. First came the envelope slipped under the suite door while Ingrid's guard stepped away for 30 seconds to respond to what turned out to be a false alarm on another floor. Inside was a scrap of fabric, a piece of the blanket Serafina had used to wrap Audrey at the underpass, a message that needed no words. "I was there. I watched you accept help. I'm still watching." Serafina's hands shook as she held the fabric. Henry watched her face cycle through terror, despair, and finally a kind of exhausted resignation that made him want to break something. She had the look of a woman who had been running so long that she had forgotten there was any other way to live. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me everything. I can't help you if I don't understand what we're fighting. And so she did, in halting sentences punctuated by long silences. Serafina revealed the shape of her nightmare. His name was Archie Vance. They had been together for 3 years, and for most of that time, Serafina had believed she was lucky. Archie was charming, successful, connected. He had swept her off her feet with grand gestures and promises of forever. He had made her feel special, chosen, protected. But forever had come with conditions she hadn't anticipated. Slowly, methodically, Archie had isolated her from friends and family. He controlled the money, the phone, the car keys. When she tried to assert herself, there were consequences. Never physical, at least not at first. Instead, he dismantled her sense of reality, made her question her own memories, her own sanity. He would tell her she had agreed to things she had never agreed to, deny conversations that had definitely happened, convince her that her perceptions were unreliable and only he could be trusted. When Audrey was born, Serafina had hoped things would change. A child would soften him. A child would give them both something to focus on besides each other. They changed. All right, they got worse. Archie saw the child as another lever of control, another weapon to hold over Serafina's head. He threatened to take Audrey away, to declare Serafina an unfit mother, to use his connections to ensure she never saw her daughter again. The breaking point came 8 months ago. Serafina had been doing temp work for a charity organization, filing paperwork and answering phones. Mindless work. But it got her out of the house, gave her a few hours of autonomy each day. One day, she accidentally accessed files she wasn't supposed to see, financial records that didn't add up, donation receipts for money that never reached the people it was supposed to help. A web of fraud that stretched upward to some very powerful names, including Archie's employer, a man named Corbin Vale. Serafina had made copies before she fully understood what she was looking at. A reflex, really. A moment of clarity in a life that had become defined by confusion. By the time she realized the danger, it was too late. Archie knew. Corbin knew. And they had made it clear that the evidence, and the woman who held it, needed to disappear. So Serafina had run. No money, no identification, no support system. Just herself, her daughter, and a USB drive hidden in the lining of Audrey's stuffed rabbit that contained enough evidence to destroy an empire. "Where is the rabbit now?" Henry asked when she finished. Serafina's eyes went to her daughter's sleeping form. Audrey's arms were wrapped around a threadbare stuffed animal, its fur matted and one ear hanging by threads. She never lets go of it, not even when she sleeps. It's her security blanket, her best friend, and our only insurance. Henry stood and walked to the window. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the city, but his mind was already racing ahead to strategies and countermeasures. This wasn't just a matter of sheltering a homeless woman and her sick child anymore. This was war, and Henry Ashford, whatever his flaws, had never lost a war behind him. His phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. "She belongs to us. Henry. Walk away while you still can." Henry stared at the message for a long moment. Then he turned to Serafina with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before. Not pity, not charity. Something harder and more valuable. Conviction. "They want you to run," he said. "They expect you to run. That's why they've been able to hunt you for this long. Because running is all they think you know how to do." Serafina's jaw tightened. "What choice do I have?" Henry walked to the internal phone and dialed. "Ingrid." I need you up here. Bring Rosalind, and have Bernie pull the car around to the service entrance." He paused, his voice taking on an edge that Serafina would come to recognize over the following hours. The edge of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. "We're not running. We're fighting back." The next several hours became a blur of planning and execution. Ingrid, once she understood the full scope of the threat, transformed from skeptical security chief to tactical commander. Her background, which she still didn't discuss, clearly included training that went far beyond hospitality management. She pulled camera footage, analyzed entry points, coordinated with her most trusted people, and began building a picture of how Corbin Vale's network operated. Rosalind, despite her initial reservations about the entire situation, proved invaluable in managing information flow. She planted false reports about Henry's whereabouts, created a smokescreen of social engagements and business meetings that existed only on paper, and began reaching out to journalists she trusted, planting seeds for the story that would eventually bloom. Bernie, steadfast Bernie, simply asked where Henry needed him to drive and when. 11 years of service had taught him that his employer's requests rarely made sense in the moment, but always made sense in retrospect. But it was Dr. Finn who delivered the news that forced their hand. Audrey's condition was deteriorating. The pneumonia wasn't responding to treatment as quickly as he'd hoped. Her oxygen levels were dropping. Her fever was climbing. She needed a hospital, needed equipment and specialists that couldn't be brought to a hotel suite, no matter how luxurious. "If we wait much longer," the doctor said quietly, "we might not be able to save her." The problem was, the moment they moved Audrey, they would be exposed. The hospital would require identification, records would be created, and Corbin Vale's people would be watching for exactly that kind of paper trail. So they created a diversion, a shell game with human pieces. At 2 a.m, 3 vehicles left the Ashford Grand through 3 different exits. The first was Henry's limousine, empty except for Bernie, heading toward Henry's downtown office. The second was a service van carrying hotel linens, with Rosalind visible in the passenger seat. The third was an unmarked SUV that slipped out through the underground parking garage, lights off, moving like a shadow through the snow-covered streets. Inside the SUV, Henry held Audrey in his arms while Serafina sat rigid with tension beside him. Ingrid drove with the focused intensity of someone who had done this kind of work before. In a previous life she rarely discussed. They almost made it. The SUV was 2 blocks from Chicago General when headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A black sedan, moving too fast for the icy roads, closing the distance with predatory intent. "We have a tail," Ingrid said, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "Hold on." What followed was a nightmare of squealing tires and near misses. The SUV weaving through empty streets while the sedan tried to force them off the road. At one point, they slid through an intersection on pure momentum, missing a delivery truck by inches. The sedan stayed with them, relentless, piloted by someone who clearly didn't care about the ice or the danger. In the back seat, Audrey whimpered in her fever-induced sleep. Serafina pulled her daughter closer, her body curved protectively just as it had been under the bridge. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, Henry's arm was around them both, anchoring them against the chaos. The sedan made its move at the entrance to the hospital parking structure. It surged forward, trying to block their path, but Ingrid was faster. She cut the wheel hard, sending the SUV through a gap that shouldn't have existed. And they burst into the emergency bay with a screech of brakes and a spray of slush. The sedan didn't follow them inside. It couldn't. Not with the security cameras and the witnesses and the flashing lights of an ambulance pulling in behind them. But as they rushed Audrey through the emergency room doors, Serafina looked back and saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot. Archie. His face was expressionless, But his eyes promised that this wasn't over. It was only beginning. The hospital should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became another battlefield. Within an hour of Audrey's admission, a man appeared at the nurse's station claiming to be a child welfare investigator. He had credentials that looked official, questions that seemed routine, and an interest in Audrey's case that set off alarm bells in the heads of everyone who had accompanied them. Ingrid intercepted him before he could reach Audrey's room. She asked for his supervisor's name, his badge number, the case file number he was supposedly investigating. His answers were smooth but ultimately empty, and when she threatened to call the actual Department of Children and Family Services, he disappeared into the hospital's maze of corridors. But the damage was done. Somewhere in the system, a flag had been raised. Serafina's name was now attached to words like investigation and custody concern. The machinery of bureaucracy, so often weaponized against the powerless, had begun to turn. Henry watched Serafina receive this news and saw something in her eyes that he recognized. The look of someone who has been beaten down so many times that they've started to believe they deserve it. The look of someone who has forgotten what it feels like to win. He spent the next 2 hours on the phone, calling in favors he had accumulated over 2 decades in business. A lawyer who specialized in custody cases, a journalist who had built her career on exposing corporate fraud, a forensic accountant who could follow money trails that others thought were untraceable. By dawn, they had a plan, and more importantly, they had an opportunity. Corbin Vale, it turned out, was scheduled to receive a humanitarian award that very evening at a gala downtown. The irony would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so high. A man who had stolen from charities, who had sent his attack dog to terrorize a mother and child, was about to be celebrated for his philanthropic contributions. The gala would be packed with media, with cameras, with witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. It was the perfect stage for an ambush. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in coordinated deception. Rosalind leaked carefully crafted stories to select journalists, hinting that something newsworthy might happen at the gala. Ingrid's team documented every attempt by Corbin's people to approach the hospital, creating a paper trail of harassment and intimidation. The forensic accountant compiled the evidence from Serafina's USB drive into a presentation that even the most financially illiterate viewer could understand. And Serafina herself did the hardest thing of all. She agreed to testify, not in a courtroom, not yet, but on camera, in a recorded statement that would be delivered to law enforcement, to journalists, to anyone who needed to see the face of the woman Corbin Vale had tried to destroy. She sat in a hospital conference room, her hands folded in her lap, and spoke for nearly an hour about the fraud she had witnessed, about the months of running and hiding, about the terror of watching her daughter get sicker while she couldn't risk seeking medical help. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even Ingrid, who prided herself on professional detachment, had to look away. That evening, as the gala guests began arriving in their designer gowns and Italian suits, a different kind of arrival was taking place at the service entrance. Henry Ashford walked into the building through a kitchen door, accompanied by Serafina, the journalist, and 2 uniformed police officers who had been briefed on the situation. They found Corbin Vale in the main ballroom, basking in the admiration of people who had no idea what he truly was. His smile was perfect, his handshake firm, his confidence absolute. It lasted exactly 4 more minutes. The journalist approached first, asking seemingly innocent questions about his charitable work. Then she produced photographs, financial records, the testimony of a woman he had thought was too broken and too scared to ever fight back. Corbin's mask slipped, just for a moment, and what lay beneath was exactly as ugly as Serafina had described. The police moved in before he could reach the exit, across the room. Archie Vance tried to disappear into the crowd, but Ingrid's people were waiting for him. He was arrested on charges of stalking, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit fraud, and standing at the edge of the chaos, watching justice finally arrive for the people who had tormented her. Serafina allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in 8 months: hope. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and slow, steady healing. Audrey recovered from her pneumonia with the resilience that only children possess. Within 2 weeks, she was sitting up in bed, demanding to know when she could go outside and play in the snow. Within a month, she was running through the hallways of the rehabilitation center where Serafina was rebuilding her life, her laughter echoing off walls that had heard too much crying. Corbin Vale's empire collapsed with satisfying thoroughness. The fraud charges were just the beginning. Investigators found evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and a pattern of witness intimidation that stretched back years. His humanitarian award was rescinded. His social circle evaporated. His name became synonymous with the very worst of corporate greed. Archie Vance pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. A restraining order ensured he would never come within 500 feet of Serafina or Audrey again. In his sentencing statement, the judge noted that his crimes had been particularly cowardly, targeting a woman and child who had done nothing except try to survive. Beatrix Coleman, the social worker assigned to Serafina's case, watched this transformation with professional interest and personal satisfaction. She had seen too many stories end badly, too many women crushed by systems that claimed to help but only made things worse. This was different. This was what it looked like when things went right. She helped Serafina navigate the bureaucracy of rebuilding a life. Identification documents, housing applications, job training programs, step by step. The infrastructure of a normal existence began to take shape. Not charity, but opportunity. Not pity, but respect. And through it all, the bond between Henry and the 2 people he had saved from the snow continued to deepen. He visited the rehabilitation center almost every day, never empty-handed. Books for Audrey, who was learning to read with voracious appetite. Flowers for Serafina, who was rediscovering what it meant to receive kindness without conditions. Small gifts that cost almost nothing but meant everything. And Henry Ashford discovered something he had thought was lost forever: the capacity to feel. On Christmas Day, exactly 1 year after the night that had changed everything, Henry stood outside a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Chicago. Snow was falling again, but gently this time, dusting the world in white without the violence of last year's blizzard. He carried a small Christmas tree under one arm and a bag of presents under the other. His coat was new but modest. His shoes were practical, chosen for warmth rather than status. He looked like a different man than the one who had stepped out of a limousine 12 months ago. Serafina opened the door before he could knock. She was wearing a sweater that actually fit, and her face had filled out. The gaunt shadows of hunger and fear replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Her eyes held warmth now, not suspicion, trust, not terror, behind her. Audrey came running, her recovered health evident in every bouncing step. She launched herself at Henry's legs and signed a single word, her fingers forming the shape she had learned from him: home. Henry knelt to her level, just as he had that first night in the snow, and signed back, home. Then he stood and looked at Serafina, and something passed between them that didn't need words or signs to be understood. An acknowledgement of how far they had come, a promise of how much further they could go. Together. They walked into the apartment, and the door closed behind them, shutting out the cold. Outside, the snow continued to fall. On the sidewalk below, 3 sets of footprints stretched toward the building's entrance. One set large and deliberate, one set small and light, and one set somewhere in between, walking close enough to touch. The third set of footprints was no longer a threat. It was a family, learning to move through the world together, in the window above. A child's hand traced a star on the frosted glass. Not a plea for help this time, just a reminder that miracles don't always come from heaven. Sometimes they step out of limousines, sometimes they kneel in the snow, sometimes they hold on when everyone else has let go. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they stay.